Hello, and welcome to Wild Words. My name is Rich, and this is a podcast where storytelling takes centre stage. A place where we can explore how stories can connect us, be teachers, and inspire us to engage and care for our wild spaces. Think of it as field notes, scribbled into your journal and stuffed into the lid of your rucksack. Or sitting around the fire with friends, old and new, sharing favourite stories and special moments. This story comes from Ian Finch. Ian is a guide and a storyteller through and through. He's passionate about narrative-led photography and filmmaking and unearthing real stories that connect people, culture and landscape all over the world. The story takes us on a coast-to-coast journey on foot through Glen Affric. And along the way we meet some of the people working to understand and protect these special places. It also explores themes of grief and our place amongst the natural cycles of nature. So, take a seat by the fire and over to Ian.
Walking through Caledon, where the forest remembers. Part 1. Morning arrives quickly in Morvick. Not with the drama of a highland sunrise or mountain peaks in shards of moody light, but with a coolness that feels almost unfamiliar, leaving a heatwave just north of London. Standing in the foot of the Kintow Mountains, I can hear the river water long before I see it. Somewhere beyond the trees, that very river slips over stone, every burn feeding in until it eventually finds its way to the sea. The stove on mossy soil hisses to life. Coffee begins to brew. The mountains wait beyond the next turn. There is something about making coffee in the outdoors that no cafe can ever recreate. It isn't simply that magical taste. It's the ritual, the hiss of the flame, the smell of the freshly ground coffee rising in the mist. For a few quiet minutes, there is nowhere else to be, and nothing else demanding your attention. No emails and no headlines, only limited signal. You simply wait as the water rolls and boils, sitting on a damp, moss-covered rock, while another day in the highlands slowly emerges. Beyond the upper cloud, I know the bare, rocky summits are there, even if I can't see them just yet. Perhaps that's what faith in a landscape looks like. You don't always need to see something to know that it exists. Long-distance walking has a gentle way of stripping life back to its essentials. Within a day or two, the questions become simple. How much water do I have? Where will I sleep tonight? Will the weather hold? Will all my chocolate last? You know, the essential information. The questions that usually occupy our minds, like deadlines, expectations, success, the endless pressure to keep up, begin to loosen their grip. Not because they disappear, but because the mountains have no interest in them. The hills don't care about your inbox. The river doesn't know your job title. The iconic pine trees have never wondered how many followers someone has online. They simply exist. After a while, you begin to remember that you can too. I've often wondered why Scotland feels different from anywhere else I've travelled in the UK. I've paddled immense rivers in Alaska beneath snow-covered mountains where salmon carry life upstream every year. I've walked through the hazy blue ridges of the Great Smoky Mountains and across northern Sweden by foot and by dog sled, where forests and lakes seem to stretch beyond the endless horizon. All of them are extraordinary places, yet Scotland always carries something else, something unique. Not emptiness, but maybe memory. Every glen feels though it remembers. Ruined crofts, forgotten drove rows like the one I sit next to now, or moss-covered stones speak quietly of lives that lived long before us. Even when people have gone, they remain in the language of the Scottish land itself. On my OS map, Gaelic place names still describe rivers, forests, hillsides and meeting places with wonderful precision. Perhaps that's why these landscapes feel so comforting. They remind us that everything changes, yet something distantly always remains. As the path climbs steadily away from Morvick, Heather brushes against boots still wet with morning dew. Foxgloves stand beside the trail, their pink bells catching droplets of dew that briefly sparkle whenever the cloud lifts. Birch leaves shimmer in the lightest breeze, while the moss wraps itself around the glacial boulders in impossible shades of green. Water shapes everything here. It softens the mountains, feeds the forests, and carves the valleys. Even the air feels as though it had passed through the rivers long before reaching your lungs. It's impossible not to feel grateful that places like this still exist, and gratitude that I'm able to be standing here. Yet the landscape I see today isn't the one that once stood here. Thousands of years ago, these glens were clothed in forest. Scots pine, birch, rowan, juniper, willow and aspen covered the highlands nearly from coast to coast. Wolves moved through the trees, lynx hunted beneath their branches. Maybe red squirrels travelled through their canopy without ever touching the ground. The mountains and the glens themselves looked different. Not bare, not open, but forested and abundant. Today's highlands can feel timeless, yet they are the product of centuries of change. Trees become timber, charcoal and fuel. Land was cleared for farming. Across much of the highlands, sustained browsing by large deer populations meant that young native trees rarely survived long enough to replace the ageing forest. The forest didn't disappear overnight. They gradually lost their ability to renew themselves. This happened century by century and generation by generation until only fragments of that immense forest remained. The strange thing is that if you don't know this history, you might never notice anything is missing. The open hills are breathtakingly beautiful. Purple heather rolls towards the rocky summits beneath the huge highland skies. Nothing really appears absent. It takes time to realise that absence can become normal. When something has been gone that long, we stop imagining it was actually even there. Walking towards Glen Affric changes that. Here, the forest is beginning to return. Later that morning, I stop beside a mountain stream to refill my water bottle. I splash a handful across my face, and for a moment, the effort of the climb disappears into the cold rush of water that began its journey high above in the cloud and rain of days gone by. These are the moments I remember most from journeys like this. Not the dramatic summits, not always the photographs. Just sitting quietly beside a river with sore shoulders, tired legs, and a mug of hot peaty coffee in my hands. They are the ordinary moments, which is exactly why they stay with us. In that moment, I realise it's been just over a year since Dad died. I still find myself talking to him most mornings. Sometimes it's simply a river or a monument I wish he could have stood beside. Some mornings I just say hello. Grief isn't always a crushing weight. More often, it becomes a quiet and just a constant companion, like a large stone in your jean pocket. Sometimes it walks beside you without really saying very much, but you feel it there somewhere. Perhaps that's another reason I return to places like this. The mountains ask nothing of you. They don't tell you to move on. They don't place a timetable on your healing. They just simply allow you to carry whatever you've brought with you. Some days that weight feels lighter. Some days it doesn't. But both seem acceptable here. Grief to me is an unfolding over time. By late morning, the clouds begin to lift. Splinters of sunlight spill across distant hillsides where young native trees are slowly reclaiming the glen behind the security of fence lines. Spiderwebs hanging in the heather become tiny constellations, each strand catching the light for only a moment before disappearing again. It is impossible not to slow down here. Modern life rewards speed. The mountains reward attention. They are very, very different things. As I shoulder my pack and continue deeper into Glen Affric, I realise this journey is becoming more than just a walk through one of Britain's most beautiful regions. From my research, it's becoming a lesson in memory, and perhaps more importantly, a lesson in hope. The forest begins again, part 2. By the second morning, the rhythm of walking has settled quietly into my body. After a night at a remote hostel and a creaky bunk, the pack no longer feels unfamiliar on my shoulders. My stride has found its own steady cadence somewhere between the filming, walking, and simply paying attention to the river that feeds the vast Glen Affric locks. Even the small discomforts, the ache in my knees, the tightness in my tired calves, the weight across my back, have become acceptable companions, rather than obstacles to find a solution for. Long-distance walking doesn't really remove discomfort. It teaches you to make peace with it. Ahead, Glen Affric stretches beneath a ceiling of low cloud. Overnight mist still clung to the branches of young birch, each passing breeze sending another shower of droplets onto the path. Somewhere beyond the trees in the far glen, the river Affric winds eastwards, gathering every burn and waterfall that tumbles from the mountains behind me. Water is never still for long in this landscape. It shapes and still shapes the glen as surely as time itself. The further I walk, the more familiar everything begins to feel here. These are locks and forests I've travelled through before, long ago, sometimes on foot, sometimes by canoe during the snowy fragments of early spring and an oncoming storm. I remember frozen fingers wrapped around a cherrywood paddle, quiet island campsites beneath snow-covered mountains, and evenings spent listening to nothing more than a gentle movement of water lapping against the gravel shore. Adventure rarely announces itself in grand moments. More often, it leaves us with an array of quiet and simple memories. Eventually, the first ancient Caledonian pines begin to appear. Their trunks are broader than I remember, their crowns twisted by centuries of highland weather. Some lean towards the light, others carry scars left by storms that passed long before any of us were born. No two trees are alike. Each tree seems to possess its own sculptural character. These aren't the trees planted in neat rows with a harvest date already decided. They are survivors, ancestors, grandmothers and grandfathers, living witnesses to another Scotland. When most people hear the words Caledonian forest, they imagine one great woodland stretching across the highlands. The reality today is a little different. What survives today are scattered fragments of a forest that once covered much of northern Scotland. Glen Affric protects one of the largest and healthiest of those remnants, where some of the remarkable pines have stood for several centuries. Their distant ancestors arrived as the last ice sheets retreated, thousands of years before roads, estates, or even written history reached these glens. Standing beneath them, it's difficult not to feel very small. Later in the journey, I met an ecologist called James, and he said something that will stay with me.
I think one of the things that really makes me care about our pine woods is that I've kind of got to know them and I feel very invested in them. So whenever you're kind of walking out onto one of these sites, whenever I first came over to the Highlands and you're exploring them for the first time, you're looking at these amazing branchy, individualistic trees. You kind of see the complexity of the ecosystem that's there, the different kind of components to it, the different species that are there, catching glimpses of some of the animals that are living in that place as well. And then, so you kind of think it's this kind of incredible natural system. And as you scratch below the surface, you find all the cultural artifacts in that system as well. So you look at the old maps and you realise that, oh, this woodland used to be bigger, or read through historical accounts and you find out about how much timber was taken out of this woodland in the past. You know, that pines from there have maybe built some of the ships used in the Napoleonic Wars, and then you start to notice other things in the pine woods. You see on some of the old pine trees, you'll find these marks from fir candle making, where basically before people had access to animal fat in parts of the Highlands to use for making candles with, they would cut out little sections of the pine trees, and because the pine were so slow grown and resinous, it was very slow burning material, so it was really good to use as candles. So all of that's there around you whenever you're in these places. There's this, it's not just all of the ecological complexity that's around you, the ancientness of that place, but also like the shadows of all the people who've been there in the past as well. So, you know, these are cultural artifacts as much as they are natural artifacts. And I think whenever you can see all of that, it's impossible not to care about those places.
On reflection, to me, the pines are a family and a community. The more I thought about James's words, the more it changed the way I looked at the landscape around me. A forest begins long before a pine reaches the skyline. It begins with light reaching the floor, with seeds carried on the wind, with birds dropping rowan berries beneath their favourite branches, with willow taking root beside the wetter ground, with fungi weaving unseen networks through the soil. Every species plays a part, and everyone depends on another. The old pines standing above me are extraordinary, but they cannot create a future on their own. The forest survives because another generation is quietly growing beneath it. That's where one of the Highlands' greatest conservation challenges begins. Through the Kintel and along the shores of Glen Affric, I cross countless deer paths etched into the peat. Narrow tracks descend steep slopes before climbing away again, worn smooth by generations of hooves following the same routes. They are beautiful and timeless animals. Seeing a red deer silhouetted against the Highland skyline is one of Scotland's great wildlife experiences. Yet the landscape stories are rarely that simple. Across many parts of the Highlands, deer numbers have remained higher than these recovering native woodlands can naturally sustain. Young pines, birch and rowan are often browsed before they can grow beyond the reach of hungry mouths. The result then is subtle. Ancient trees remain, but the seedlings disappear. What survives is a woodland growing steadily older, but not necessarily younger. Maybe perhaps that's the simplest way to understand this restoration. It isn't about planting endless trees. It's about creating the conditions for forests to renew themselves once again, with open conversations about, from all sides, what can be achieved. Further along the glen, I stop beside a wide gravel bank where the river slows into quiet turning pools, stained amber by the surrounding peat. The water is so clear that every rounded stone beneath the current seems close enough to touch. Lunch is simple: noodles and broth, another mug of hot peaty coffee. Luxury enough for another morning's walk, but I know those calories just won't cut it. As I sit beside the river, another conversation comes to me. This one with someone working on the return of the beaver to the Highlands.
It doesn't take years for things to change. They start felling trees, they start stripping bark. Trees then start to coppice, they don't die. So you have thrashy new growth everywhere. They put a dam in, all of a sudden you've got a wetland. More insects because everything's damp and wet. So everything changes. You get more insects, you have more amphibians, you have more bird life. The fish are doing better. Really quick change. So that's why they're called ecosystem engineers. They're a keystone species.
It's easy to think of beavers simply as another species coming home after centuries of absence. They change entire landscapes. Every tree they fell, every channel they dig, and every dam they build slows the water that would otherwise rush downstream. Life gathers wherever water is allowed to linger. Listening to those working with beavers, I realised that they are not simply restoring an animal. They are helping rivers remember how they once behaved. The forests shaped these rivers, and the rivers shaped these forests. For thousands of years, neither existed without the other. As the afternoon unfolds, the path climbs gently through the scattered birch before returning once more beneath the towering Caledonian pines. One enormous tree lies fallen beside the track, its roots lifted high into the air like the upturned bottom of a wineglass. I rested my hands against its weathered stone grey trunk. How many winters had this tree endured? How many generations of people had passed, like me, beneath its branches? Even lying motionless on the floor, it continues to give life. Mosses and lichens spread across its bark, fern growth in a little branch pocket. Insects disappear beneath those limbs of timber. and young seedlings reach towards the light, now pouring through the gap it has left behind. In a healthy forest, even death becomes part of renewal. Not long afterwards, I passed a small interpretation board explaining the important woodland restoration taking place around me. I wonder how many walkers stop to read it. Some probably continue without slowing. Others linger. I'm glad they do, because understanding changes the way we see. Before this journey, I simply admired those remarkable trees from a canoe. Now, I find myself searching for seedlings beneath them, looking for signs of browsing, wondering why one hillside is beginning to recover while another still waits. I believe awareness changes observation, and observation becomes care. And perhaps care and action is where restoration truly begins. As evening draws closer, another voice echoes in my thoughts. This time, Gaelic historian Franny, who I'd spoke to later in my Highlands journey. She spoke about the names carried by these hills, rivers and forests. Across the Highlands, place names were never chosen by chance.
Gaelic place names are a way of understanding the landscape, so understanding that people knew this landscape. So somewhere like Glen Affric feels to many people really remote and lacking in people today. But if you look at a map, every wee lump and every little stream has a name. It's not like it's just the huge Munros have names. Every little feature in the landscape has a name. In Gaelic, there's over 100 different words for different types of mountain, instead of in English saying hill or mountain. There's so many different words describing every different type of hill and every different type of mountain. There's over 40 different types of different words for bog, for different types of bog. I think it indicates that people were navigating across this landscape and they needed all the help they could get. They needed to name every little feature. So people knew this landscape really, really well to be naming every last inch of it. So the fact that so few people know it so well now, it wasn't always like that. And I think it stops a place feeling remote or empty of people. It indicates that people knew it, like the geographical layout of the land and what the hills were like, what the terrain was like, but also knew where they would find deer or where they would find the ripest berries or where they should have their sheilings, that kind of thing. It indicates what you would be using the landscape for as well, in a landscape that we don't think of as that productive today.
Long before maps even existed, language became a way of understanding the land. It also became a system of navigation. Walking here now, I realise I'm no longer seeing only mountains, rivers, lochs and forests. I'm beginning to hear them too. The trees hold memory in place. The rivers carry memory to the next river, and eventually to the sea. Even the names whisper memory to anyone willing to listen. By late afternoon, the cloud begins to lift once more. Beyond the forest, the glen opens towards Cannock. After days immersed in quiet and wild land, the distant sound of children's voices, a barking dog, and someone cutting grass feels strangely unfamiliar. A bus also sits in a lay-by near a local shop. Civilization hasn't interrupted the landscape, it's just simply become another part of it. I pause for one last look back towards Glen Affric from a clearing. The ancient pines disappear into soft highland layers. From here, it would be easy to think of them as simply another beautiful forest. But I know differently now. They're not merely surviving quietly and patiently. They're beginning again. Seeds of Hope, Part 3. Every long journey reaches a moment when you realise it's almost over. It rarely arrives at the finish. More often, it appears somewhere beforehand, when your body is still walking but your mind has already begun looking back. For me, that moment came high above Loch Ness, on the heather-strewn hills heading northeast. The path climbed steeply through the plantations before emerging onto open hillsides, stretching west towards the distant blue folds of the highlands, lay everything I had walked. Somewhere beyond those blue hazy ridges was Glen Affric. Beyond that, the mountains of Kintail. And further still, Morvick, where only a few mornings earlier I'd sat waiting for that coffee to boil while the mountains hid quietly behind cloud. It's remarkable how quickly place becomes a memory. The tired body continues forwards, the mind keeps wandering back, through, and sometimes within. People often ask why we walk long distances. I don't think there's ever a single answer. Sometimes we walk to discover something new. Sometimes we walk because life has become maybe too noisy. Sometimes we're searching for an ounce of solitude to recalibrate. As I walked towards Inverness, I realised this journey had become something new and unexpected. It simply wasn't just a long walk through one of Britain's most beautiful landscapes, but a gentle lesson in restoration. When I first entered Glen Affric, I saw on either side the beautiful Caledonian forest, but now I saw relationships. I noticed seedlings beneath the ancient pines. I looked for browse lines on young birch. I watched the rivers differently, imagining how they once wandered through the woodland long before they were confined by our modern ideas of order and control. The landscape itself hadn't changed. I had. I think learning has a quiet way of altering the world around us. Once you care and understand what you're looking at, you can never quite see the same way again. It's easy to think of conservation as a challenging conversation, and it is. Ecologists, land managers, farmers, foresters, estate workers and government agencies each bring in different experiences, different priorities and different responsibilities. Sometimes those conversations are productive, nuanced and difficult. And perhaps they maybe should be, because landscapes are complicated too. They have always been shaped by people as much as by weather, rivers and time. Yet walking through Glen Affric and later speaking with people dedicating their careers to caring for these places, I was struck by something far more hopeful than disagreement. Almost everyone in their own way wanted the same thing. A healthy landscape, a living forest, clear rivers, thriving wildlife, places that future generations might love as deeply as we do today. I believe we can do this by learning to understand one another. The forest itself seemed wonderfully indifferent to my opinions. A Scots pine doesn't know who owns the hillside. It only knows whether its seedlings survive. The river doesn't understand policy. It simply follows gravity onwards towards the sea. The woodland doesn't recognise boundaries drawn on maps. It responds to rainfall, sunlight, grazing, and to time. Nature has always been patient, and perhaps that's one of life's greatest lessons. It reminds us that meaningful change is rarely immediate. A forest is not restored in a season. It grows seed by seed, cone by cone, generation by generation. Somewhere along the trail, I found myself thinking about Dad again. I still catch myself wanting to tell him about places like this, to bring something back for him. About people I met, the stories they shared, the best fishing spots on the river, even about the old pines standing quietly above the loch. He would have loved the antiquity of this place. Grief has changed over the past year. People often speak about moving on, but I'm no longer sure that's the right phrase. I don't think we ever move on. I just think we move with it. Like the rivers flowing through these glens, grief keeps travelling. Sometimes it rushes through narrow places with unexpected force. Sometimes it slows into quiet pools, but it never really truly disappears. We simply become stronger at carrying it. Perhaps that's why this landscape has stayed with me. The Caledonian forest isn't trying to become what it once was. I'm not sure it could. Too much has changed. Restoration isn't about turning the clock backwards. It's about carrying the past forward with understanding. As I reached the outskirts of Inverness, the sounds of the city gradually returned. Children laughed in the nearby gardens. Wood pigeons fought for space on the rooftops. The landscape hadn't become separate from the world I was returning to. It had simply changed the way I saw it. Perhaps that's the true gift of journeys like these. They don't ask us to escape our lives, but they invite us to return to them differently, with slower eyes and quieter thoughts. This walk through the Highlands reminded me that while we cannot return to the past, we can choose together to grow something worthy of the future.
Thank you so much to Ian for that beautiful story. If you'd like to find out more about Ian and his work guiding, you can head to walkwilduk.co.uk. You can also find out more about his storytelling at ianefinch.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Wild Words. Until next time.